Right now, somewhere in the southern waters of the Persian Gulf, a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil has cut its engines. It is not anchored. It is drifting, holding position in a kind of suspended animation, 17 nautical miles from the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. Its crew can smell the diesel exhaust of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps patrol boats that have been circling within visual range since dawn. The captain has received 2 messages in the past 4 hours. One from his shipping company, telling him to wait. One from his insurer, telling him that if the vessel enters the strait, his policy is suspended. He is waiting because there is no better option. And he is not alone. As of this morning, maritime tracking data shows 63 tankers in various states of holding pattern in the Gulf of Oman and the northern Arabian Sea. Between them, they are carrying approximately 126 million barrels of crude oil, refined petroleum products, liquefied natural gas, and condensate that cannot move. That oil is destined for refineries in Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore, and China. Those refineries are now counting days, not weeks, until their feedstock inventories run critically low. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz does not affect global oil supply as an abstract economic variable. It affects it as a physical, logistical, hour-by-hour problem. 20% of all the oil that moves anywhere in the world passes through a channel 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And that channel is now, for all practical purposes, closed. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly 3 things. First, the sequence of military decisions that made this closure not just possible but strategically inevitable. Second, the cascade of economic consequences that begins the moment those tankers stop moving, and who gets hit first, hardest, and longest. And third, the 3 scenarios that analysts are working through right now, including the one that no government will say publicly, but every strategic planning office has already gamed. Stay with me, because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not a regional crisis. It is a stress test of the entire architecture of modern economic life. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to January 4th, 2020. That was the day a U.S. airstrike killed IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport, and Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei publicly promised severe revenge. That promise was not forgotten. It was filed, and for the next 4 years, Iran prosecuted what military analysts call a forward defense strategy, keeping threats as far from Iranian territory as possible by activating proxies across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. Houthi forces in Yemen, operating with Iranian-supplied ballistic missiles and drone technology, turned the southern Red Sea into a contested waterway beginning in late 2023. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Red Sea's southern choke point, was already degraded as a commercial shipping lane. Major carriers rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. Insurance premiums for transiting the Red Sea tripled. That was the first choke point. But it was never the one that truly mattered. The Strait of Hormuz has always been Iran's ultimate lever, the one it has threatened to use for decades and never fully deployed. The reason is straightforward. Closing Hormuz hurts Iran too. Roughly 90% of Iran's own oil exports exit through the same strait. Using Hormuz as a weapon is an act of mutual destruction. For that reason, Western analysts consistently rated a full Hormuz closure as a low-probability event. They built their models on deterrence logic. Iran would not saw off the branch it was sitting on. What changed that calculus was a series of events between March and August of this year. In March, the United States reimposed comprehensive secondary sanctions on Iranian crude exports, targeting the so-called shadow fleet, the network of aging tankers that had been moving Iranian oil to Chinese refiners in defiance of existing sanctions. The move was accompanied by a diplomatic offensive that persuaded several Southeast Asian ports to deny entry to vessels with documented Iranian cargo links. Iranian crude exports, which had recovered to approximately 7 million barrels per day by late 2023, collapsed toward 800,000 barrels per day by June. Tehran's foreign currency reserves, already strained, began depleting at an accelerated rate. In May, the Israeli Air Force conducted a strike package targeting Iranian-linked munitions facilities in eastern Syria and a command node near Deir ez-Zor. Tehran condemned the strikes. The international response was muted. In June, a follow-on strike reportedly targeted a ship in the port of Bandar Imam Khomeini, a vessel Iran described as a civilian research platform, and the United States and Israel described as an IRGC logistics vessel supporting maritime drone operations. 3 IRGC personnel were killed. That was the threshold. That was the moment the internal calculus in Tehran shifted from strategic patience to, we have nothing left to protect by waiting. On the morning of the event that opened this video, IRGC naval forces, operating fast attack craft, submarines, and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries, announced a temporary security zone covering the full breadth of the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial traffic was advised to seek clearance from IRGC Maritime Command before entering. No clearance procedure was specified. No clearance has been granted since the announcement. The strait is not physically blocked. It is psychologically and commercially closed, which, in terms of global oil flow, amounts to exactly the same thing. Let us now examine what the military picture actually looks like, because the phrase Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz carries with it decades of rhetorical history that has perhaps dulled its impact. The reality of what Iran can do in that strait, today with current inventory, is substantially more capable than it was the last time this scenario was seriously modeled by Western planners in 2012. Iran's anti-ship capability in the strait rests on three overlapping layers. The first is the fast attack craft fleet, IRGC speedboats, operating in swarm tactics, capable of closing on a supertanker at speeds exceeding 50 knots and deploying contact mines, torpedoes, or rocket-propelled grenades at close range. These craft are individually low-value targets, but in sufficient numbers they represent a threat that is extremely difficult to counter without accepting rules of engagement that amount to initiating general hostilities. The second layer is shore-based anti-ship missiles. Iran has spent the better part of 15 years hardening, dispersing, and expanding its coastal missile batteries. The Noor missile, an Iranian reverse-engineered version of the Chinese C-802, has a range of 120 kilometers and has been deployed in multiple battery configurations along the strait's northern shore. More capable still is the Khalij Fars ballistic anti-ship missile, a modified Fateh 110 with a range of 300 kilometers, specifically designed to target large surface vessels, exactly the profile of a VLCC supertanker. Military strategists have noted something that had not been seen before in modern history: a coastal nation deploying precision ballistic munitions specifically optimized for maritime targeting, removing the radar jamming countermeasures that made previous generation anti-ship missiles vulnerable. The third layer is the submarine fleet. Iran operates 3 Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines acquired from Russia, supplemented by a larger number of domestically produced midget submarines, the Ghadir class, which are specifically designed for shallow water operations in the Gulf. Diesel-electric submarines running on battery power in shallow, warm water are among the most difficult targets for surface ASW assets to detect. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has the assets to operate in this environment, but not without risk and not without a clear political mandate to initiate kinetic action. That mandate is precisely what is missing. Here's what military strategists are actually saying in the assessments that have been circulating since the closure announcement. The United States has the capability to force the strait open through a combination of mine-sweeping operations, naval escort, and suppression of IRGC patrol activity. What it does not have, right now, today, is the political consensus to do it. 2 allied carrier strike groups are currently in the region, the USS Harry S. Truman Group, which repositioned from the eastern Mediterranean, and the USS Carl Vinson Group, which was conducting operations in the Indo-Pacific and has begun a transit toward the Gulf. But carrier groups are powerful deterrents and powerful instruments of force. They are not, by themselves, a solution to the problem of a coastal nation that has dispersed its anti-ship capability into hardened mountain tunnels and mobile launchers. The capability gap that this moment reveals is not American naval power. It is the absence of a diplomatic framework that constrains Iranian escalation without requiring a military operation that could ignite a general regional war. The precedent this breaks is decades of deterrence-based management of the Hormuz threat. The understanding, never formalized but broadly operative, was that Iran would rattle this particular saber but never fully draw it. That threshold has now been crossed. The Strait of Hormuz that existed before this closure is not coming back, even if the closure ends tomorrow. The insurance industry will reprice the risk. Shipping companies will demand naval escorts. Transit costs will embed a permanent risk premium. And every nation that imports oil through this waterway will now treat Hormuz security as a first-order national security concern, accelerating investments in strategic reserves, alternative pipelines, and energy diversification. The world has been warned. The question is what it does with the warning. Now let us follow the money, because this is where the story moves from a military briefing to something that reaches into your life, your city, and your weekly grocery run. The immediate market reaction was sharp and fast. Brent crude, which had been trading near $79 per barrel in the days before the closure announcement, jumped to $103 within the first 6 hours of trading after the news broke. By the end of the second trading session, it had touched $118. That is not a spike driven by panic alone. It is a price signal encoding real physical scarcity. 21% of global oil supply has abruptly become inaccessible, and futures markets are pricing the expected pain. Here is something that no economist had cleanly modeled before this event: the speed of the transmission mechanism. In previous Hormuz scares, 2011, 2019, 2020, the threat was rhetorical, and markets corrected within days as the bluff was called. This time, the closure is physical. Tankers are not moving. Port operators in Japan, South Korea, and India are not receiving cargoes they were expecting. The gap between threat and supply disruption has closed to zero, and markets are pricing accordingly. Let me put this in concrete terms. Japan holds approximately 145 days of strategic petroleum reserves, government-held stocks plus mandatory commercial stocks combined. That sounds comfortable until you account for the fact that Japan's operational refining capacity runs on the assumption of continuous replenishment. The strategic reserve is a buffer, not a replacement. South Korea holds roughly 100 days. India, and this is the number that concerns analysts most, holds between 20 and 25 days of operational petroleum reserves. China's strategic reserve situation is more opaque, but independent estimates place usable strategic stocks at 75 to 90 days. None of these numbers account for the possibility that the closure extends beyond a few weeks. The transmission mechanism from crude price to consumer experience runs through 4 channels, and they operate on different timelines. The first is gasoline and diesel, which reflects crude price changes within approximately 10 to 14 days at the retail level. A $40 per barrel increase in Brent crude translates, through refinery margins and distribution costs, to approximately 35 to 45 cents per gallon at U.S. pumps, more in markets with thinner domestic production buffers. In Europe, where fuel taxes are higher as a percentage of retail price, the absolute impact is smaller proportionally, but still significant. The second channel is petrochemicals, which are the feedstock for plastics, fertilizers, synthetic fibers, and pharmaceuticals. A closure that restricts naphtha flows, naphtha being a light crude fraction, disrupts the entire global plastics manufacturing supply chain within 30 to 60 days. This is the channel that most people do not think about when they hear oil crisis. The fertilizer channel is particularly acute. Ammonia synthesis requires natural gas, much of which also transits Hormuz as LNG. Disrupted LNG supply from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter and a Strait-dependent nation, means disrupted fertilizer production, which means disrupted crop yields in the next growing season. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from the IRGC patrol boats in the Strait of Hormuz to the price of bread in your city. The third channel is shipping costs broadly. With 63 tankers holding position, the vessels that are attempting to route around through the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 12,000 kilometers and 10 to 14 days to their transit, are driving spot shipping rates sharply higher. The Baltic Dirty Tanker Index has already moved more than 40% in the first 48 hours. Higher shipping costs are inflationary across every category of traded good, not just energy. Electronics components, automotive parts, pharmaceutical raw materials. Everything that moves in a shipping container is subject to a cost environment being reshaped by this closure. The fourth channel, the slowest but potentially most consequential, is the sovereign debt channel. Countries that are both heavy oil importers and carry large current account deficits, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, several sub-Saharan African economies, will find their import bills rising at exactly the moment their foreign exchange reserves are least able to absorb the shock. A sustained Hormuz closure measured in months, not days, could trigger sovereign debt crises in 3 to 5 vulnerable economies, each of which would then require IMF intervention and generate their own political instability. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. Because the next 2 weeks of price data will tell you far more about how long this closure lasts than any government statement will. Now let us turn to the diplomatic chessboard, because the military and economic situation we have described creates a very specific set of incentives and constraints for every party involved. And understanding those incentives is the only way to assess what happens next. The United States' public position is that the closure is unacceptable, that freedom of navigation is a core American interest, and that all options are on the table. The private position circulating in Washington policy circles is considerably more complicated. 2 presidential candidates are currently in a campaign cycle in which a military confrontation with Iran carries enormous domestic political risk, regardless of outcome. A successful reopening of the strait through naval force requires either sustained combat operations against IRGC assets or a very fast Iranian capitulation, and neither outcome is certain. The administration is, by all accounts, under simultaneous pressure from Gulf state allies to act decisively and from European allies to pursue a diplomatic solution before the economic damage cascades into recession. Iran's public position is that the security zone is a defensive response to acts of war by Israel and to American economic sanctions that constitute, in Tehran's framing, a siege. The private incentive structure in Tehran is more nuanced. The IRGC hardliners who pushed for the closure are not the same faction as the diplomatic establishment that has, on previous occasions, used Hormuz threats as negotiating leverage without ever fully deploying them. The current closure creates a problem for the Iranian government. It has now used its ultimate card, and the question of what comes after, whether the closure can be lifted without appearing to capitulate, is a genuine internal political challenge. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain, are in a position of acute discomfort. They share American concern about Iranian power and have generally supported the sanctions regime. But their own oil exports also transit Hormuz, and a prolonged closure damages their revenues and their leverage. Saudi Arabia has quietly begun conversations with Oman, the one Gulf state that maintains functional diplomatic relations with Tehran, about whether there is a face-saving formula that allows the IRGC to withdraw the security zone announcement without framing it as a defeat. China is watching this situation with a mixture of strategic interest and operational anxiety. Beijing imports approximately 17 million barrels per day, and a significant portion of that transits Hormuz. China has consistently opposed Western sanctions on Iran and has been one of the primary buyers of sanctioned Iranian crude. It is now in the position of being economically harmed by the behavior of a country it has implicitly enabled. Beijing has made quiet back-channel contact with Tehran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization framework, encouraging de-escalation while simultaneously activating emergency procurement from Russian pipeline supplies. The unexpected mediator in this situation is Oman. Muscat has served as the back channel between Washington and Tehran in every major diplomatic episode of the past 2 decades, including the preliminary contacts that led to the 2015 JCPOA negotiations. Oman shares a maritime border with Iran, maintains trade relations with both Tehran and Washington, and has a strong economic interest in an open strait. Omani foreign ministry officials have, according to diplomatic sources, been in contact with both Iranian and American counterparts within hours of the closure announcement. The gap between what each side needs to be able to tell its domestic audience is significant, but it is not unbridgeable. Iran needs to be able to say it achieved something concrete. The United States needs to be able to say it did not reward aggression. Finding a formulation that satisfies both is the central diplomatic puzzle of the next 10 days. And here's the thing the headlines aren't telling you. The scenario analysis that actually matters is not about what the parties want in public. It is about what happens if the diplomacy fails. Let us now examine 3 scenarios. The first scenario is negotiated resolution. This requires, at minimum, 4 things: a partial rollback of the most recent round of secondary sanctions, an Iranian commitment to a time-limited suspension of the security zone declaration, a U.S. brokered commitment from Israel to pause offensive operations against Iranian-linked targets for a defined period, and a face-saving announcement from Tehran that frames the suspension as a goodwill confidence-building measure rather than a capitulation. This scenario is possible. The Omani back channel is active. American economic policymakers understand that a $118 oil price sustained for more than 60 days is a recession-inducing event in a U.S. economy that is already navigating elevated inflation. And Iran's supreme leader, whatever his public rhetoric, is not operating a government without resource constraints. The sanctions pressure has been genuinely damaging. A partial sanctions relief, particularly on frozen assets, gives Tehran something to show its domestic audience. The scenario is difficult because of the Israeli variable. Washington cannot guarantee Israeli restraint, and Iran cannot credibly de-escalate if it expects another strike the following week. But it is the most likely outcome if the diplomatic momentum established through Oman can be sustained. The second scenario is continued attrition. In this scenario, the security zone remains in place for 4 to 8 weeks. Tankers continue to avoid the strait. A small number of vessels attempt transit under Gulf state escort, and there are 1 or 2 incidents, warning shots, perhaps a disabled vessel, that keep the situation at a low boil without crossing into open warfare. The United States conducts mine-sweeping and surveillance operations in the strait approaches, but does not directly engage IRGC assets. Oil prices settle into a range between $110 and $125 per barrel. India begins rationing industrial diesel. Several European economies enter technical recession. Pakistan, whose foreign currency reserves were already critically low, requests an emergency IMF disbursement. The political costs accumulate on every side. Iran's own population, already suffering under sanctions, begins to feel the inflationary pressure of a disrupted domestic economy. American allies in the Gulf begin to question Washington's commitment. China accelerates pipeline negotiations with Russia. The attrition scenario does not resolve. It merely continues, generating economic damage that compounds week by week, until one side's internal political calculus tips toward either escalation or negotiation. The third scenario is catastrophic escalation. This is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night, and it does not require any single dramatic decision. It requires only a sequence of miscalculations. Here's the scenario as it has been gamed. An American or Saudi naval escort accompanies a Kuwaiti crude tanker into the strait. IRGC fast attack craft approach to within harassment distance. A warning shot is fired, by whom it will later be disputed. Return fire kills 3 IRGC personnel. Iran responds within 24 hours with a Khalij Fars ballistic anti-ship missile strike that damages, but does not sink, a Maersk container vessel carrying no military cargo. The United States, under enormous domestic political pressure to respond, authorizes strikes against the missile battery responsible. Iran responds with a Sejil-2 ballistic missile strike against the U.S. Fifth Fleet facility in Bahrain. At that point, the engagement has crossed from managed confrontation into general military conflict. Israeli air assets, interpreting the situation as strategic opportunity, conduct strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Hezbollah activates from the north. The Gulf states, whose territory now hosts American military operations, face the choice of whether to openly join or quietly distance themselves. And the oil infrastructure of the entire Persian Gulf, which is concentrated in facilities that have no meaningful hardening against ballistic missile attack, becomes a target on every side. Here is something that no analyst had seen before in modern history: the simultaneous kinetic targeting of both sides' energy infrastructure within the same 3-day operational window. Brent crude would not reach $200 per barrel in that scenario. It would simply cease to be meaningfully priced because the question of whether any oil would flow from the Gulf at all would be genuinely open. Watch the Omani back channel. Watch the Indian Petroleum Reserve announcements. Watch whether Israel makes any public statement acknowledging American requests for restraint. Those 3 signals in the next 5 to 7 days will tell you more about which of these scenarios is unfolding than anything that appears in a government press conference. Let us connect this back to your life, because this is not abstract. The price of diesel in your city will move within 10 days. The price of the electricity you use in any country where gas turbines generate a meaningful share of grid power, and that includes most of Europe and South Asia, will move within 30 days. The price of food, because of the fertilizer and refrigerated transport channels, will move within 60 to 90 days. The cost of a flight, aviation fuel is directly priced on crude markets, will move the moment the airlines reprice their hedging positions. And the cost of the medications you take, if any of them are manufactured using petrochemical feedstocks, which includes the majority of modern pharmaceuticals, will be subject to supply disruptions within 90 to 120 days. This is not a crisis that happens on the other side of the world and stays there. The Strait of Hormuz is a bottleneck in the circulatory system of the global economy, and what happens at a bottleneck eventually reaches every extremity. Zoom out for a moment to the historical weight of this moment. The last time a major maritime choke point was effectively closed to commercial traffic for more than a week was the closure of the Suez Canal following the Six-Day War in 1967, a closure that lasted 8 years and fundamentally reshaped global shipping patterns. The Suez closure was a consequence of war, not a strategic weapon. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is being deployed deliberately, as leverage, by a state actor that has calculated, perhaps correctly, that the world's dependence on this specific piece of ocean is now so complete that threatening it is worth more than any other card in the deck. The world of globalized, just-in-time energy supply that existed before this closure is not coming back in the same form. Whatever resolution emerges from the diplomatic negotiations currently underway in Muscat, the insurance industry will have repriced Hormuz risk permanently. The shipping industry will have begun building a surcharge into every contract that covers Gulf exposure. The governments of Japan, South Korea, and India will have convened emergency sessions of their national security councils to map out scenarios for partial or full Hormuz denial, and they will now fund strategic reserve expansions and alternative supply contracts that they previously treated as low-priority insurance policies. The open question, the one this video cannot answer because no one can answer it yet, is this: if Iran has now used its ultimate strategic card, what comes after? Does the closure achieve enough in sanctions relief, in changed Israeli behavior, in diplomatic recognition to justify the economic costs Tehran is simultaneously paying? Or does this become the moment that united the Gulf states, the United States, and the major Asian importers into a coalition that, for the first time, treats Iranian maritime behavior as a threat serious enough to demand a permanent military and diplomatic solution? The answer to that question will determine the shape of the next decade of energy geopolitics, and it will not be answered in the next press conference. It will be answered slowly, in back rooms, in insurance actuarial tables, and in the quiet decisions of tanker captains who are, right now, still drifting. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.